How you doing? Welcome to my channel. It's the first episode that I'm ready to put out there. I wanted to talk about some things that I have an interest in, curiosity in, and I'm going to talk about something that changed my life. It was a book that I read, nonfiction book, and the name of the book is "And I Don't Want to Live This Life," and it was written by a woman named Deborah Spungen. It's the story of her daughter, Nancy Spungen. Now, Nancy Spungen might not mean anything to you yet. Sid Vicious might mean something to you. I believe that you know who Nancy Spungen is, regardless of your age, because I think that you've at least seen an image of her. She's known, and Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols are known as rock and roll's Romeo and Juliet, because they both end up dead. Nancy, when she's 20 years old. There are many things that you can read about Sid and about Nancy. But there's only so many things that tell the story about Nancy Spungen and who she actually was. Her infamy is that she was found dead in October of 1978 in the Chelsea Hotel by a single stab wound to her stomach. It was said that Sid Vicious killed her. Sid Vicious later killed himself. There's been theories that maybe it wasn't Sid Vicious. He was so messed up, he doesn't really remember. He said he did it, and then he said he didn't do it, and then things have come out later, well after, that there was a drug dealer who might have been responsible for the death of Nancy Spungen. I don't really want to get into all of that because how she died, you can look that up. Where she died, room 100 of the Chelsea Hotel, you can look that up. All about Sid Vicious and basically their relationship, you can look that up. But there was more to Nancy than that. She was 20 years old and she ended up dead. Who was she? Well, let's find out. Bing, boing, bing. Everybody has a story to tell with Toddy One Skip. You probably don't know who Nancy Spungen is. Do you know who Sid Vicious is? The Sex Pistols. So Sid Vicious was the bassist for the Sex Pistols. Nancy Spungen was his girlfriend of 19 months. She was found dead. Single stab wound. New York City, Chelsea Hotel, room 100. October 12th, 1978. She was 20 years old. I remember when I saw that story in the headlines. I was about 16 years old, and I'm 5 years younger than Nancy. And I remember saying to myself, or maybe even out loud because I was quite arrogant, oh, no big deal, another druggie gone. Who cares? Shame on me. That was somebody's daughter. Shame on me, I didn't know any better at 16 years old. But worse than that, shame on everybody that let Nancy down. She was more than Sid Vicious's girlfriend. She was more than a casualty that was found in the bathroom floor of the Chelsea Hotel under the sink. Bled to death. She was a 20-year-old kid who actually accomplished everything she wanted to do, everything she wanted to be in life. That's the truth. She traveled when she was 16. She moved to New York when she was 17. She moved to England when she was 18. For 19 months, she was in a relationship with one of the more popular punk rock bands, the Sex Pistols. She was in England not only did she pick up the bassist of the Sex Pistols, Sid Vicious, she picked up the accent. Nancy was great at accents. There was a lot to her. She was a daughter. She was a sister, probably not a very good one, as we hear. She got along better with her brother. But she was a person. She was born February 27th, 1958, to Frank Spungen, and his wife, Deborah, Deborah, Spungen. He was a salesman. He was in the military before, and then he was a salesman. She was a stay-at-home mom. This was their first child. They lived in the suburb of Pennsylvania, of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They were middle class. They were Jewish. And I bring that up because back then, there was a culture about that. A lot of times with Jews, they don't really care how things are. They care how things look. And I can say that. My family was like that. But they actually cared a great deal about Nancy. The problem happened when Nancy was born. So Nancy was born in Philadelphia, and she was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. So she was deprived oxygen, and she needed blood transfusion like 2-3 days old. These are things people don't know about this woman. All they know is all the bad things that they called her, all the rotten things that they said about her, all the jokes that were made about her, even after her death. I'd like to think that we've come a bit of a way from that mess now. Nancy had a lot of personality, and when I read the book, And I Don't Want to Live This Life Anymore, which her mom wrote after Nancy had died, I remember how ashamed I was, thinking, oh, no big deal, a drug addict, another drug addict died. I thought, wow, look at how this young person was let down. Look at how her whole family was let down. Look at how everybody failed her. See, back then, doctors weren't obligated to tell parents the fate of their children, whether it be mentally or whether it be physically. And again, when Nancy was born, the umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck, deprived her of oxygen, and she had very high bilirubin levels. Now, I'm not a doctor, you can look that up, but from what I've discovered, it's the bile when you're throwing up, and there's nothing more to throw up, that's bile, right? Tastes terrible. The bile in Nancy's bilirubin levels when she was born were approximately 300 degrees less than what they would be to cause cerebral palsy, mental retardation, which is what it was called back then, autism, neurological damage. Nancy's bilirubin levels were climbing when finally when they gave her transfusion. They said there was no brain damage. But Nancy wasn't your normal child. And the worst bit about it was this was Deborah's and Frank's first child, so they had no comparison to how children should be. By 3 months old, Nancy was on liquid barbiturates. She was a drug addict before she was a year old. Because when Nancy would cry, she wouldn't cry, she would scream. These blood-curdling screams. Nancy had a stammer. But if Nancy wanted you dead as a child, she would tell you exactly how she was going to dispose of your body. Something was not right with Nancy, right? I mean, that's not normal. Nancy threatened her babysitter. Nancy attacked people with hammers. Nancy didn't really want to hurt so much as she wanted to kill. Are people born like that, or did something happen when Nancy was born? Something that her parents tried to address many times, but was told, she's a normal kid, she'll grow out of it. Just love her. Just love her. That's like loving the alien. You can't turn your back on her. How are you going to love her? Yet here was this articulate kid that was going to tell you how she was going to dispose of your body. There wasn't a lot of... I don't remember reading where Nancy was a loving person or people felt loved by her. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia at 15 years old. But at 11 years old, she was kicked out of school for missing so many classes. Now, people would say, where's the parents? Things weren't like that. They didn't, everything was assumed. What happened in Nancy's first 24 to 48 hours of her life coming into this world? There was some sort of short circuit that was never addressed. Things weren't diagnosed as they were now. You didn't talk about things like you did today. You didn't do any of that. All Nancy wanted to do and wanted to be, it seems like, was anybody other than Nancy, including those accents that she would pick up wherever she would go. I saw a video of her. She was from Pennsylvania. Yet you could hear her take on the persona of somebody else. She had black hair, but it was bleached blonde, you know. She was friendly with Blondie. Who does that? She died at 20 years old, but all she wanted to do was be famous. She was infamous, unfortunately infamous. Have a rock star boyfriend, achieved. She was in London. She wanted to do that whole punk rock London scene. She did it all at a very young age. Wanted to live in New York, did that, moved to New York. So let's go through like the time span of her life. So driving everybody crazy in her house to the point where they don't know what to do with her. They've taken her to the doctors. They've taken her to the psychologist. They've taken her. And the only time that she's diagnosed with not being sane, basically, and yes, there is something wrong, is when she's 15 years old, but they've medicated her throughout her whole life. They have her go to, they send her to like a boarding school, but a good boarding school that cares, right? That boarding school takes her off all of the medication that any doctor has ever put her on. Now she's grown up with, if something's wrong, I could take a pill, it'll fix it. I could take a pill, it'll fix it. I could take this drug, it'll fix it. Since 3 months old, right? They've taken all of her drugs. What does she do? Well, before it was popular, she went to self-medicate herself, but not self-medicate herself like it would end up being, but self-medicating herself because that's how it was done from 3 months old. If something's wrong, take a pill and fix it. How'd that happen? Her family were afraid of her. I'd be afraid of her. You know, you didn't know what would set her off. I mean, there was fights over everything, what to eat, what to watch, how to breathe. Everything was a hassle when Nancy wanted confrontation. And Nancy really didn't seem to like quiet. So they sent her to this boarding school. And she did graduate. She graduated at 16 years old from high school and started her first semester in Colorado. She wanted to go to the University of Colorado. She got in at the University of Colorado at 16 years old. 5 months into that, she gets caught selling or buying weed. It wasn't legal back then. And stolen goods that were in her dorm. They kick her out of Colorado. Youngest person ever kicked out of Colorado? I don't know. But that's pretty extreme, you know, to get kicked out of a state for. 17 years old. She moves to New York City. She wants to get in with the rock and roll bands there. She has a little bit of success getting in with rock and roll bands there. But that's not enough for her. She's got this urge for the punk rock scene in London. I think her grandmother gave her money, or her grandmother passed. Somehow her grandmother gifted her money, and she took that little bit of money and she went to London. So in New York, when she was there, because it's expensive to live there, it's always been expensive to live there, her living was basically anything she could do. And unfortunately, the oldest profession in the world. I don't think she had a lot of respect for herself. I don't think she had a lot of worth for herself. I don't think she had a lot of self-love. Despite what her family had given her, I don't think she knew what it was. I don't think she had the tools to know what to do with it. Not sure that she recognized it. There was something misdiagnosed with Nancy, you know, for a long time, obviously. She goes to London and hooks up with a very popular group, right? I'm not saying that they were all great, and I don't want to hear sex, but Sid Vicious really didn't know how to play. And they screamed a lot. They're iconic. I don't know how much for their music or how much for the death of Nancy Spungen. See how that worked? Nancy helped Sid in many, many ways. In many ways. Not so good ways, but not so bad ways. I think that they were messed together. Sid's mom, from my understanding, Sid was already pretty much messed up prior to meeting Nancy. That's what some people say. And then some people say, not so much. Nancy brought this on. And that probably Sid was a virgin until Nancy. Their love, I'm not saying it was a healthy love, but I think that they loved each other. I think that they felt loved by each other most of the time. They had problems. They were constantly high, just nodding out. You can see videos of them, and you know they're memes now. It's sad because there are two young people, and Nancy, who could be anything. She could have been anything in life, right? Anything she could have been, but she ended up being a heroin addict. But she ended up, as weird as it sounds, she ended up doing exactly what she said. She said she wasn't going to live to 21. That's true. She said she wasn't going to live to 21. She didn't. She said she was going to be famous. She's famous for being infamous, right? Same difference, infamous. She wanted to be important and loved by a rock star, and she was. Right? As sick as whatever they could do together. That's right. And that's what happened. But I remember reading that headline, and I remember thinking nothing of it. And then I remember my friend loaned me the book, and I was a lifeguard in Florida, and we were going through hurricane season, and I still had to go to work, and we were expecting a hurricane, and I was so bored. And I was talking to my mom, and my mom said, why don't you bring that? Because I was like, I'm so bored. What am I going to do there? She was like, why don't you bring that book that your friend gave you? My mom had read the book and said, I think that you'll like it. I was not a big fan. I wasn't a great reader at the time. I couldn't really retain what I was reading. This book I couldn't put down. And I was so ashamed at everything. I was ashamed at the way Nancy was treated all those years, how her parents were treated, embarrassed to bring their kid in for help because the doctors didn't have an obligation to say, man, your kid's fucking loco, They didn't. And they gave these parents no help. And she dies at 20 years old. Imagine what she could have done if there wasn't that darkness, that gnawing of whatever drove her to the dark side of things and the unhappy, whatever it was, whether it was, and I think it was from birth. Imagine that energy in a different way. She was creative. Her mom had these crazy letters from her daughter. Shoily from the deli, Nancy had great, she could do great imitations. She could laugh and she could be funny and witty. I think she could be those things, but I think she was very disturbed. I think that there was never any kind of stability that she would find within herself, and the doctors let her down. And then after the tragedy, I say another junkie gone. But Saturday Night Live makes skits about it. Johnny Carson makes jokes about it. And I was 16 when I said what I said, right? When I was 22 or 23 and I was reading the book, I was ashamed for what I thought. That was somebody's kid. That was somebody's sister. That was somebody's granddaughter. That was somebody that unfortunately didn't have a fair chance. I used to think if you got into trouble, you asked for it. I don't think that. And I stopped thinking that after I read, and I don't want to live this life. It changed my view to don't judge. You don't know. You don't understand. Don't pretend you do. And that book has kind of stuck with me. I actually wrote the screenplay from the book, and I have a letter from the mom telling me that I could peddle that screenplay. And I wrote that screenplay in the 80s. 80s or early 90s. I can prove all of that. But it was taken from the book. And again, a must read. You can't put it down. It's still so timely today. So timely today. It goes through a little bit about Sid, and because they were only together for 19 months. But it goes through how, when she met Sid, and how when Deborah went to pick up her daughter at the train station or bus station with Sid, and they were both black, spiky hair. Nancy had the platinum blonde, but Sid had this crazy, and they would look dirty and everything, and they are oblivious. They're in their own little world, and everybody else is looking at them like, you know, and, you know, if that's not really hurting anybody, that's kind of nice, you know, as long as you're not hurting anybody, and well before your time. I mean, now, so what? And Nancy struggles, and them going to the methadone clinic, and when Sid grabs a guitar from the Spungen house, and unfortunately can't keep time, and Nancy's belief in him, and how she managed him, you know, the last, I don't know, months of his life, her life. You know, there's been movies about them. There has been myths about them, folklore about them. What's the other? There's been so much about them. And really, they're like the rock and roll Romeo and Juliet. But there was never enough really said about Nancy. And I wanted to make sure that just because that book changed my life and my way of thinking, and my arrogance and my ignorance to how others could live and or die in their life, that we shouldn't judge. I really wanted to start with that on this channel, and just say that, you know, I hope things have changed over the course of time. I hope that we don't look at people like that anymore. I hope that we're not so easily eager to point our fingers and judge and diagnose. You know, everybody has a story to tell. And when you really do hear Nancy's story, there's not a lot of funny in it, you know. There's not a lot of, wow. And I don't think that there's a lot of, she got what she deserved. Certainly not any of that, you know. Some of the behavior is a little funny. It's a little absurd. I don't think that her family would deny that. But the death wasn't like coming to her. That wasn't something that was deserved, in my opinion. You know, she was a lost kid. She's 20 years old in New York City with Sid Vicious. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. If you have anything that you want to know, or any comments or anything like that, you know, you can do that. And that's it. Have a great, what day is it? Friday? Have a great Friday.